Hi guys, and welcome to TechFurb. Today, first episode ever shot in 4K. I have a brand new camera and I'm super excited to be using it. So anyway, today's actual video is about an AMD FX 6300. So let's get into that. Okay, so system in question here, this is the FX 6300 system. It's on the test bench. I paired it with a 970 board. It's an MSI 970 Gaming for reference. It has 16 gigabytes of DDR3 1600 megahertz RAM. It's a 4x4 kit. It's all matching, which is a miracle. It's very rare that you get 4 matching DIMMs. But I was given this by a friend. It was an old board, he didn't want anymore, which is why it was matching. So, as for the GPU benchmarks, now I went 2 extremes. So I'll give you the first GPU I benchmarked with, which was the GTX 1050. Logical choice, if you have this CPU, this is the GPU you'd be pairing it with. And a 1060 or higher is probably not going to be great. But a 1050 should be appropriate for the 6300 based on my experience with other CPUs and sort of my expectations of this one. So that's why I went with a 1050. It is a 2 gig model, it's not a 4 gig 1050 Ti, it's just the 2 gig vanilla GTX 1050. So now, the other extreme I went to was I actually plunked in a GTX 1080. Now the logic behind that was I just wanted to see how far the damn thing could push. Because once you put a 1080 in there, it's not going to bottleneck that CPU. That CPU is going to run to its absolute limit, trying to keep up with the 1080, and it's going to get nowhere near the limits of the 1080, I can tell you that. Now, with the 1050 benchmarks, I did not overclock when the 1050 was in the system. I had expected it to be bottlenecked by the 1050, and for a reference point with the 1050, I also plonked it in my Ryzen 7 system. So you'll see benchmarks with the GTX 1050 from a Ryzen 7 system and a stock frequency of this chip, because everyone can get stock frequency. Not everyone can overclock. That's probably a point I want to lean into here. So with the overclocking, that was done with the GTX 1080, so you'll only have 2 results with the 1080, the stock frequency and the overclock frequency. I wanted to do the Ryzen 7 as well with the 1080, but I didn't see the point, and to be honest, it's a lot of time to do just a benchmark run for an additional system, so that's why I dropped that. So it'll only be 4 configs, I'm sorry. So the overclock I achieved was 4.5 gigahertz, and you know, that's pretty good for these chips. I've heard of people getting a little bit higher than that, but the problem is you start to really stress a VRM on a motherboard, and this motherboard was no exception. Has really good cooling and has really good VRM for a 970 board, which, by the way, if you're going anything higher than a 970, just get the frickin' 8 core. But you know, very good board for this CPU. I did have to put a cooling fan on the Northridge because it got pretty toasty, which is a limitation of these CPUs. So the 6300, when it's overclocked, it chews in excess of 100 watts of power for a 6-core part. Especially by today's standards, that's really freaking bad. So very, very power hungry when overclocked. It's stock, it's not too bad. It doesn't use a lot of power, which is why there's so much overclocking headroom. But the problem is, as soon as you start to overclock it, its efficiency just goes absolutely out the window. So kind of sucks. But yeah, 4.5 gigahertz overclock. I could hit it. I had to run at voltages I didn't want to run at to hit it, but I did it. So I think we should jump into some benchmark charts. Alright, so first benchmark off the ranks, we're going to have Star Wars Battlefront 2. It's at 1080p Ultra in inverted commas, which is whatever the maximum settings are. That's when I say Ultra, that's what I'm referring to. It's the maximum possible settings. Now, we'll work from the bottom and go our way up. So at the bottom there, the FX stock with the 1050. It got 48 frames per second on average, 34 for the 1% lows and 21 for the 0.1% lows. It was a little stuttery, but as you can see from the Ryzen 7, it wasn't bottlenecked. The Ryzen 7 also got very similar numbers. It got 49 average frames per second, 41 1% lows and 25 0.1s. Now, yeah, the 0.1s and the 1s are a little bit lower, but I gotta be honest, as far as I can tell, the 1050 is the bottleneck, which is fantastic news. That means that the FX 6300 can cut it in that game. Awesome. So then we move up to the GTX 1080, and this is where the bottleneck starts to come in. So 91 frames per second on average, 52 on the 1% lows, and 28 on the 0.1s. Now, the significance of this is this game with a let's say a 9900K or a Ryzen 7 2700X, it would be absolutely running away into the high hundreds. It would be a lot higher than that. And as can be seen from the next step up, as soon as you overclock it, we get to 112 average frames per second. Big jump. And 69 for the 1% and 37 for the 0.1s. Now, when I overclocked with that 1080, it was very, very buttery smooth. It may have had the occasional hiccup, but it ran pretty well. So, overall, I was pretty happy with Star Wars Battlefront 2. Mind you, the game has been out for, I want to say, about a year. I think it was late 2017, early 2018 that game came out. So, you know, it's had a bit of a time. So, let's move on to the next one. Now, Ghost Recon Wildlands. This is possibly the hardest to second hardest game I have to benchmark. And I've got to say, it held up well in this game. So Ghost Recon Wildlands, 1080p high preset, not on Ultra. I might note that this was only on the high preset because this game is so graphically intensive. Even with a GTX 1080 and like a 9900K, this game will barely crack 100 frames per second. It's really, really poorly optimized. Having said that, we did see the CPU bottleneck a little bit with the 1050, so we got an average of 29 frames per second, 1% of 23, 0.1% of 5. When you jump up to the Ryzen 7, you get a little bit of frames back. It gets 34, 1% of 28, and 0.1% of 6. Now, mild stutters, it still did run it. I was satisfied with it running the game. But here's the thing, once you jump up to GTX 1080, yes, the numbers do normalize. You're starting to get 60 on average and 66 on average, even with the overclock. But the problem is that 1080 is masking the problem with the with the CPU, because when the maximum frames come into frame, sorry for a poor expression, it'll get into the high 80s, 90s, 100, and it drags the average right up there, which is kind of why I don't like doing benchmark graphs in this way. So this game was a little bit stuttery on the CPU, and I'm borderline saying it was playable, but it's not a great experience. So that was the takeaway from this benchmark. Next up was CSGO. Now this, oh boy, it wasn't great. So stock with the GTX 1050, it got 107 frames per second. Remember, this is CSGO. This is a title that has high frame rates by default. Even though it is on the highest preset, it still gets very high frame rates. So 107 on average, 66 1% lows, and 48.1% lows. Let's have a look at the Ryzen 7 with the GTX 1050. It jumps up to 140 frames per second. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. This is with the 1050. We're already getting a massive, I want to say about 30 to 40% bottlenecking happening. That's pretty crazy. And then if you have a look at the 6300 with a 1080, got 103 on average, which is insane. It's getting the same or thereabouts same numbers as it is with the 1050. So not good. When overclocked, it did recover some, and it came up to 134 average. But again, the Ryzen 7 with a 1050 is still beating it in its overclocked form with a 1080. So that's not looking great. But in fairness, it ran the game. It's at 107 frames per second. So let's be honest, you're not going to be disappointed with that if you're like a budget gamer. Not bad. But yeah, not a great showing from the 6300 in that benchmark. The Ryzen 7, again we're at ultra settings, so maximum settings. With the 1050, the 6300 didn't fare so well. It was only 37 frames per second on average, 1% of 20 and 0.1% of 17. Whereas with the Ryzen 7, the 1% lows with the GTX 1050 were almost the same as the averages. So again, unfortunately we're seeing the CPU bottleneck at GTX 1050, so it's got that going for it. That's not good. So yeah, 6300 stock with the 1080. We saw 77 frames per second and 92 frames per second when you went to the overclock. So I guess Doom started a little bit on the CPU, but it ran okay. And I think the pattern we're kind of finding here is it does the job, it just doesn't do the best job that other CPUs could. So unfortunately, if you're dropping in a second gen i5, a second gen i7, you're going to be noticing a difference in performance, even with like a GTX 1050, which is a crazy thing for me to say, but unfortunately it looks like the 6300 is having a CPU bottleneck on that 1050 in some games. So we'll move on to F1 2017. Now this is primarily a CPU bound benchmark I've found. I've found that this is like always hard on CPUs. It gives you good scaling. But we didn't see that here. The 6300 performed really well. It pretty much matched the 1700. 1700 had a weird 0.1% low, but that may have just been a stutter. Then, you know, stock to overclock, we see a little bit of a bump. But generally across the board, I was pretty happy with this game. It performed pretty well. And you can see that there's over 100% gain between the 1050 to the 1080. Which again, those high frames kind of help the average. But we'll go to Battlefield 1 now. And this was interesting actually. This is the only time, I think, where the 1050 actually outstripped the Ryzen 7. May have had a couple of good extra frames in there. But yeah, we're not seeing the bottleneck here. And with the 1080, we were getting up to 76 and up to as far as 89. So that was pretty impressive with the overclock on. So I was pretty stoked on those results. Next up we go to PUBG, and this is a tough title. Now again, bottleneck starts to come back into it. We're seeing the Ryzen 7 struggle. The Ryzen 7 do well. 6300 starts to struggle a bit with that 1050, and it kind of stutters and jitters, and it doesn't run very well. With the 1080, it was only 52 frames per second. Once overclocked, we got right up to 88. So we're seeing here that the 6300 kind of a bottleneck, not doing great. And once overclocked, it comes good. So, you know, it's kind of how the cookie crumbles with that one. Fallout 76. Now, I will give you this proviso with Fallout 76. Remember that this game has a frame cap of 60 frames per second. Very important. That's why a lot of reviewers don't use this benchmark. But for myself, I just got the game. Kind of want to justify the expense a little bit. I'm enjoying playing it, but that's beside the point. And I really wanted to know how the 6300 would go on this system, and I'm sure some of you out there with the 6300 thinking of getting Fallout 76, this benchmark is for you. So we see with the 1050 we're getting 41 frames per second, 1% lows of 18 and 0.1 of 8. When you jump up to the Ryzen 7, a little bit of a bottleneck lift. We go to 52 on average, 27 1% and 13.1%. Fallout 76 is prone to a bit of stuttering. It's a pretty buggy game in terms of performance. It's really not that great. And it bottlenecks heavily on PC, even with the 1080 or an RX 480. It still stutters in my Ryzen 7 system with an RX 480, and that's a really good 1080p card. So anyway, so we see, yeah, like I said, bit of a jump between the 7 and the 1050. So again, 6300, it's bottlenecking its GPU with that 1050 in there. It's not great. Moving to Fortnite, things return to happiness with the 6300. We're seeing that 46 versus 43 for 7 against 6300. That's good. 0.1% and 1% are relatively the same, with the 0.1% dipping a little bit with Fortnite. But overall, I've got to say the experience was not a stuttery mess. But Fortnite is a very well optimized game that runs really well on PC. On even older hardware, it runs really well. So, you know, Yeah, that's kind of the way the cookie crumbles with that one. I'm pretty pleased with that result. And what else is there to say there? Not a big difference between the overclock 6300. There was a difference, but not a big one. So that was interesting to note. 84 versus 91. Read into that what you want. What have I done? Okay. Okay. So, out of the gaming benchmarks, into synthetics. So, synthetics tell you a little bit of the story, but not the whole thing. So we'll glaze over this quickly. Firestrike, you see nice little bit of scaling. When overclocked, we get a nice bump with the 1080. But the 1050 versus the 1050, you got to remember that Ryzen 7 is 8 cores and 16 threads. In the CPU section of that benchmark, it is just going to absolutely crush it because lots of cores, lots of threads. This benchmark scales very well. And, you know, that's why it outscores the 6300. We'll glaze over this one. TimeSpy, same thing again. Synthetic benchmark prefers those high-end CPUs with more cores and more threads. Higher IPC, you know, it's kind of not a fair comparison, but there is a difference. So I'm more interested in the gaming benchmarks, but I do the synthetics anyway because I try and get as good a coverage as I can. So not a lot to pull out of this benchmark. We'll move on. Now, Cinebench, this is important because with Cinebench, I can give you reference points of how I know other CPUs can perform. So, Ryzen 7 was overclocked to 3.4 gigahertz. That was the case through all the benchmarks, but that would make no difference with that 1050. A stock 1700 will bottleneck a 1050 very, very, very hard. It'll bottleneck a 480 at that. Actually, I've done testing before and I found that the Ryzen 7 will bottleneck before RX 480 as well, which is to be expected of a high-end CPU. So, focusing on the 6300 here, we've got the stock, 415 points. Overclocked, it gets up to 511. Now, if you are looking at a second gen i7, it's going to get up around the 600s in Cinebench. So, remember that. If you're looking at an i5 2400, it's getting around the 400-ish mark in Cinebench, which is about on par with the 6300. Now, here's the key point. The 6300 has 6 cores. The 2400 has 4 cores. Now, when your thread count is that low, that's an important thing because all of a sudden single core performance becomes a very important factor in these low core count CPUs. You're going to find that the 2400 is just going to walk all over this 6300 in a lot of benchmarks, which is not great. Ryzen 7 does have lower IPC, but because it's got a lot of cores and its IPC is not that far off Intel's, it gets away with a lot of things. So that was not the case with the bulldozer to whatever the heck crappy FX CPUs AMD produced. They just couldn't compete anywhere near Intel on single core performance. Like the performance gaps were 50% in some cases. It was quite horrendous. Yeah, so that's not great Cinebench results from a 6-core CPU. Anyway, that's the data. The data's the data. You can go and look that up against other benchmarks if you are curious. Now, this last benchmark is relevant to me. It may be relevant to you if you're a content creator. It is Premiere CS6. Now, I don't use Creative Cloud because the subscription is horrendously expensive, and I'm not a photo guy. I don't take photos. I don't use Photoshop. I don't use all the features. I just edit my stuff in Premiere, and then that's it. I'm done. I maybe do something in After Effects occasionally, maybe do something in Photoshop occasionally, but I don't do a whole lot. CS6 works for me, and that is why I'm benchmarking with it. So, that point aside, we are looking at a 7-minute video. This is like footage that came off my old non-4K camera. It's 1080p footage at 50 frames per second. The bitrate is 46 megabit per second, which for reference is quite high compared to something like, say, YouTube. YouTube is more like 10. So it's a very high bitrate, which means the files are quite large. You're looking at about a 2.5-ish gig file for that 7 minutes, roughly speaking, of footage. So quite a large file size for a 1080p file. And in terms of the render, the Ryzen 7 1700 being the benchmark, this is what I use for my rendering. This is what I expect. 808 seconds, that translates into, I think it was 13 minutes and 28 seconds if I remember correctly. I can't remember the exact mass. But when you jump to the 6300, you were looking at 20 minutes of time to render that video. Now this is with no GPU assistance. With GPU assistance it would be a lot quicker, but CS6 didn't have GPU acceleration except for a couple of CPUs, and there's a hack I can do to use it, but I'm interested in CPU performance, which is why I'm not using it in this benchmark. So yeah, that's the last benchmark, that's all the data, so let's roll into a conclusion. Okay, so I guess consolidating all my thoughts on this chip, because I've spent about a week prepping for this video. It's very time consuming to do benchmarks, especially when I have to work full time 5 days a week. I do this YouTube stuff on the side. You guys follow the channel, you know that. So it makes it challenging doing benchmarks like this. But anyway, besides the point, I do it because I love it and I do it for you guys, to give you guys the content. My thoughts on the 6300, having come through all of that benchmarking, having some data to look at, having a look at the graphs. Let's answer the question. Can it still game in 2018? Yes, absolutely. Of course it can. Now, with that in mind, so if you have this CPU, that's great. Awesome. You can still game. Would I upgrade from this CPU if I had any resemblance of money to replace my system? Abso-freaking-lutely. If you are stuck on this 6300, you have the opportunity to go to a Ryzen 3, hell, an i3, or anything low-end budget grade. It's going to be a big jump from this 6300. Ryzen 3 2200G would absolutely throttle this thing in all of these benchmarks. Hell, if you want to jump all the way up to my Ryzen 7 system, go for your life. But if you bought a 6300, you're a budget guy. And you're probably looking at maybe Ryzen 3, Ryzen 5, or Pentium to maybe i5 in Intel, because Intel's very overpriced at the moment. Honestly, I would recommend the Ryzen series for budget builders. It's just a better platform, better value for money. But yeah, I've got to say that the 6300 is a CPU that if you're stuck on it, that's fine. If it's doing the job for you, keep using it. You might get another year or two out of it, and then it's just, eventually it's going to become useless as more new titles come out. It's on the brink. It's kind of where the Core 2 Quad Q6600 was for me in 2017 when I did the review. I go back and look at that CPU now, and it's kind of on the brink. I wouldn't use it in a gaming system anymore. Some people will say they can. Power to them. If you feel like you can use it in a gaming system, that's fine. But yeah, 6300, I wouldn't go out of my way to buy one. I would certainly go out of my way to get rid of one if I had it in my system. But it's not a bad CPU. It does the job. It's just very, very outdated by this point. So thanks for watching, guys. Leave a like if you liked it, leave a dislike if you disliked it. Comments down below if you've got any questions for me. Also guys, I'm so freaking excited about this 4K camera. I promise I'm going to do an awesome build for you guys. I just had this video in the works. Sorry, I got the camera while I was in the middle of getting this, preparing this video, so I kind of committed to this being the first 4K video. It's really not the first thing I want to do on the 4K camera, but that's fine. So yeah, thank you to my loyal followers. Thank you for you guys who watch this content freaking every time I upload. I'm so thrilled and happy that you guys do that. It's awesome. And the channel goals, where it's getting close to 1,000 subscribers now, which is a huge milestone. We're very close to 200,000 channel views, which is huge for me. I didn't expect it to get this big within like 2 years of being on YouTube. And mind you, I've never had a viral video as well. I haven't had something just go viral and just absolutely drag my averages and numbers up. It's been a lot of hard work and a lot of hard-earned views, and I'm really proud of where I am with the channel. So yeah, anyway, enough from me, guys. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next video.